Two Native American sisters disappear in 1945. 40 years later, brother makes a shocking discovery. In the arid heart of the American Southwest, where the winds whisper across the desert and the red clay stretches for miles, the Navajo Nation lives deeply rooted in tradition. New Mexico and Arizona lands once lived on by the ancestors of the Navajo stand as silent witnesses to their ancient stories, their triumphs, and their heartaches. Amidst the towering mesas and endless plains, Thomas Red Elk sat alone in his old rusted camper, his eyes fixed on the photograph before him, faded and weathered by time, yet forever etched in his memory. It was 1985. Thomas, now 58 years old, had spent the past 4 decades searching for his 3 sisters, Sarah, Naomi, and Ava, who had mysteriously disappeared in 1945. The memory of that day and the following years haunted him like a constant storm. 40 years had passed since the Bureau of Indian Affairs had come to his family's home in Cottonwood Bluffs. He had been just 14 when they took his sisters away under the guise of government education and promises of a brighter future. The Indian boarding school system was infamous for stripping children of their culture, language, and traditions, forcing them into conformity with the dominant white Christian society. Thomas had been separated from his sisters, forced to endure the brutality of a place that sought to erase everything about him that made him Navajo. He had been enrolled in a different boys' school, while his sisters were sent to St. Gertrude's Indian boarding school, a place where their fates would take a dark turn. On the surface, the school was presented as a place of learning and salvation, offering an education that would help the children succeed in the modern world. But beneath the surface, the truth was far darker. The school was a prison. The children were subjected to grueling physical labor, religious indoctrination, and emotional isolation. Speaking their native language, Navajo, was forbidden. The girls and boys were kept strictly apart, with only brief moments of interaction during Mass and devotions. Those moments, brief as they were the only times Thomas could see his sisters, always under the watchful eyes of priests and nuns who saw them as little more than objects to be molded and controlled. It wasn't until one fateful day in 1945, when Thomas was 18 years old, that his world was shattered. The school was preparing for a visit from the press, a staged display meant to showcase the effectiveness of the assimilation programs. The children were dressed up, their hair braided neatly and lined up like a human display for the cameras. Sarah, Naomi, and Ava were chosen specifically for their innocent beauty, their faces capturing the essence of what the press needed to portray the success of the Americanization process. But after the press left, something went terribly wrong. The day after the photo shoot, his sisters were gone. At first, Thomas hadn't realized what had happened. It wasn't until the morning Mass, when Sarah, Naomi, and Ava didn't take their usual seats, that he began to feel the stirrings of panic. When evening devotions came, and they still hadn't appeared, fear set in. He approached the guards, demanding to know where his sisters were, but the response was brutal and cold. They told him nothing, and in return for his insistence, locked him in the basement for 3 days and beat him for questioning the authorities. He was told to forget he ever had sisters, as if their existence had been a figment of his imagination. But Thomas couldn't forget. Despite the beatings and the threats, he didn't give up. At 18, he was technically an adult, and the school's half-hearted search efforts lasted only a few days, before they were abandoned altogether. No missing child flyers were made, no police investigations were launched. The disappearance of 3 Native American girls was not something the authorities cared about. As far as they were concerned, the incident was just another casualty in the long history of indigenous people being erased from history. Thomas was forced to escape. The years that followed were full of wandering and searching. He lived in the dusty towns of the Southwest, moving from place to place, always following rumors, whispers, and the photograph he carried with him everywhere. A photograph of his sisters standing on the steps of the school chapel, their faces frozen in time. For 4 decades he chased shadows. He showed the photo to anyone who would listen, searching for any clue, any hint of what had happened to Sarah, Naomi, and Ava. He never gave up on the hope that one day he would find them. But now, in 1985, after years of searching and endless dead ends, he sat in a dusty town called Whispering Rock, a place that had become his home, not out of hope, but out of resignation. The town was dying just as he felt he was. The days of chasing his sisters seemed long behind him, yet he held on to the fragments of his past, the few belongings he had left, and the unshakable belief that he would find his sisters, or at least discover the truth of what had happened to them. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, and the cool desert wind picked up, Thomas pulled out a battered yellowed newspaper from the passenger seat of his camper. The headline, which had haunted him for decades, read, "Indian Boarding Schools Forging America's Bright Future." The accompanying photo, taken long ago, featured Sarah, Naomi, and Ava on the wooden steps of the chapel at St. Gertrude's School. He studied the photograph as he had done countless times before. The image was haunting Sarah's hands, folded in her lap, Naomi's shoulder slightly tilted from an old injury, and little Eva's serious expression, as though the weight of the world rested on her small frame. Thomas had always known that this photo, like everything else the boarding school had taken from him, was part of a lie. His sisters had never been saved or protected. Instead, they had been stolen from their culture and their family. With a deep sigh, Thomas folded the paper and put it back on the seat beside him. It was time to take another drink and get ready for another long night of searching for a truth that still eluded him. But for now, in the stillness of the desert night, surrounded by the echoes of his past, he allowed himself a moment of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance to find his sisters and to uncover the truth that had been hidden for so many years. Thomas Red Elk's hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel of his old rusted camper. The dust of the desert roads clung to the windows, but the vast, empty landscape outside the windshield felt oddly familiar, almost suffocating. The desert had always been both a sanctuary and a prison to him, a place where the land held secrets, ancient, unspoken truths buried in the sand. And now, after all these years, the time had come to uncover some of those truths. The road ahead stretched out like an endless ribbon, winding through mesas and cacti. As he drove through the small towns of New Mexico, he couldn't help but reflect on the past those 4 decades of endless searching. The faces of the people he'd met along the way blurred in his memory. Some had been kind, offering him a meal or a place to stay. Others had turned away, too weary of their own lives to care about a man lost in a quest for the past. But no one had ever been able to give him the answers he so desperately sought. The questions remained: what happened to Sarah, Naomi, and Ava? Why had they disappeared without a trace? And what was it about that photograph, those small, subtle details that always seemed to elude his understanding? He was haunted by the memories, haunted by the image of his sisters, trapped in that moment in time. The photograph, yellowed and brittle, now had been taken decades ago on the steps of the chapel at St. Gertrude's School, shortly before the press came for a visit. The day they took the photo, everything had seemed so ordinary, so routine. But it was the day after, when his sisters vanished without a word, that the world around him shattered. Thomas pulled over in front of an old diner, a place he'd visited often over the years. The fluorescent lights inside flickered as he entered. Behind the counter, the cook, an elderly man named Jack, nodded in recognition. "Thomas, you look like hell," Jack said, his voice raspy. "You still chasing those ghosts?" Thomas didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slid onto a stool and stared at the half-empty mug of coffee in front of him. The smell of fried food and stale cigarette smoke lingered in the air. "I've found something," Thomas said quietly, after a long pause. Jack raised an eyebrow, his hands still busy behind the counter. "What's that supposed to mean?" Thomas reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the tattered photograph, unfolding it slowly. He placed it on the counter, the faces of his sisters frozen in time. "I think I'm close," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The nuns from St. Gertrude's School, They knew something. I've seen a woman, an older nun, with a scar on her face. The same scar Naomi had. It's her, I swear it. Jack looked down at the photograph, his expression unreadable. You've been saying that for years, Thomas. Every time you think you've found something, it slips away. Why should this time be different? Thomas's fists clenched, the frustration bubbling up inside him. Because I saw it. I saw the scar. She's real, Jack. She's one of them. One of the women who took them. Jack's face softened, but he didn't say anything. He just continued to wipe down the counter, his movements slow and deliberate. He knew better than to challenge Thomas' certainty. For years the man had searched tirelessly, following leads that always seemed to end in dead ends. He couldn't bring himself to doubt Thomas now. You still got that address book? Jack asked, his voice low. Thomas nodded and pulled the small book from his coat. It was worn and battered, its pages filled with names, addresses, and phone numbers that led to nothing. He flipped through it absently before he reached the name he was looking for. Clyde Yazzie, he said aloud. I need to see him. Jack gave a small nod. He's still up in those mountains, isn't he? Doing his plant stuff. Thomas didn't answer. He just closed the book, stuffed it into his pocket, and stood up. There was no time to waste. He needed answers, and Clyde Yazzie might be the key to uncovering the truth. The mountains were quiet, their rugged peaks bathed in the golden light of the late afternoon sun. Tommy drove through the winding roads, the engine of his camper sputtering with age, but still managing to keep moving. The landscape shifted as he ascended the dry, cracked earth, giving way to the cool, almost eerie quiet of the higher elevations. It wasn't long before he reached the familiar stretch of road near the edge of a canyon. It was the same place he had encountered Clyde 20 years ago, that fateful moment when the stranger had saved him from falling into the chasm. The memory was faint now, lost beneath layers of time and pain, but it was enough to spark a sense of familiarity. Tommy needed help, and Clyde was the closest thing he had to a friend left. The town of Santa Rosa came into view after another hour of driving. A small, quiet place with dust swirling in the streets and a sense of timelessness hanging in the air. The signs of the town's older name, Silico, were still visible in faded, cracked road signs that no one had bothered to replace. Tommy parked the camper and looked around. His heart pounded as he walked through the quiet streets, and after asking for directions, he finally reached a modest house on the outskirts of town. He stood in front of it, unsure of what to expect. The address book had given him the location of Clyde Yazzie's office. It was just a small residential building, now tucked away behind trees. As Tommy approached the door, he paused for a moment, his breath catching in his chest. There was no turning back. Whatever he found here could change everything. With a deep breath, he knocked. The door creaked open, revealing Clyde, older now, with graying hair and deep lines etched into his face. Tommy, Clyde said with a nod. I figured you'd show up. What's going on? Tommy wasted no time. He explained everything: the photo, the scar, the mysterious nun, and the haunting silence of the church. Clyde listened carefully, his face growing more serious with every word. When Tommy finished, Clyde took a long breath. Let's go, Tommy, he said, determination in his eyes. You're not going to do this alone. I owe you that much. Tommy felt a surge of gratitude, but he knew the road ahead was going to be far from easy. The truth about what had happened to his sisters was buried deep, shrouded by time power, and a system that had long silenced the voices of people like him. As they left the house, Clyde's voice was calm but firm. We'll find them, Tommy, but we need to be careful. This isn't just about your sisters anymore. It's bigger than that. Tommy nodded, the weight of the years pressing down on him once again. But this time he felt something he hadn't felt in decades: hope. He wasn't alone anymore. And maybe, just maybe, the truth was finally within reach. The afternoon sun burned relentlessly over the desert, and Tommy's hands gripped the steering wheel of his old camper, his knuckles white from tension. The gravel roads wound through the barren land, past craggy rocks and dry bushes that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep doing this. The years of searching, of hoping, and of failing each moment had left its mark on him, a layer of dust and regret. But now, for the first time in decades, he could feel something stir deep inside him, a spark of hope. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The discovery at the monastery, the scar on the nun's face, had shaken him to the core. Could it really be Naomi, his sister, the one who had been taken from him all those years ago? Tommy pushed the thought aside. Hope was dangerous. It was easier to bury the pain and the longing deep within, as he had done for so long. But this was different. This time he wasn't alone. Clyde Yazzie, the man who had once saved his life in the mountains, was with him, and together they would find the answers no matter where they led. Clyde had been a quiet, steadfast presence ever since Tommy had found him in Santa Rosa. Though much had changed since their last encounter, both in their lives and in the world around them, the bond they shared had not. They both knew what it was like to lose something precious. For Tommy, it was his family. For Clyde, it was the connection to his homeland, his heritage stripped away piece by the encroaching world. As they made their way through the rugged terrain, Clyde finally spoke, his voice breaking the silence that had settled between them. "You know," he began slowly, "I've heard stories about places like the monastery before, about men of faith using their positions to manipulate people, especially the vulnerable. But I never thought it would be like this." Tommy glanced over at him, surprised. "You've heard of this kind of thing before?" Clyde nodded, his expression grim. "There are always whispers, Tommy. Some of them are just rumors, but others are the kind of stories that make you wonder what people will do when they're given too much power. Those nuns, the ones who stay silent, most of them are indigenous. I've met a few, talked to a couple over the years. They're always tight-lipped, secretive, but there's something in their eyes, like they've seen something they can't forget." Tommy's heart pounded in his chest as the weight of Clyde's words sank in. The silence that had surrounded the nuns for so long, the secrecy, everything now seemed connected. Had his sisters been part of this? Had they been forced into the same life of silence and obedience that he had witnessed in the monastery? He clenched his jaw, the question rising to the surface, but he held it back. There was no use in speculating. He needed to see the truth with his own eyes. The road ahead began to narrow, the dirt turning into rocky paths, and the landscape shifted again, becoming more desolate. The mountains loomed ahead, jagged and harsh, their peaks dusted with the faintest touch of snow. The sense of isolation deepened here, as if the world had turned its back on everything that had happened in the past. Tommy had always thought the land would remember, would somehow hold the secrets of his sisters, of all the pain that had been buried over the years. He had spent so much time in this land searching, hoping, praying. But what had he really found? Nothing but dead ends and lost memories. But now it seemed the land had a new story to tell. As they drove deeper into the desert, Tommy felt the stirring of something, maybe not just hope, but a call from the past, a whisper in the wind that promised to finally reveal what had been hidden for so long. As they reached the edge of the mountains, the shadows of the evening stretched long across the land. The compound that Tommy had followed the van to earlier came into view, a place that had looked so benign from a distance, but up close it felt ominous. The fences were high, the gates locked, and the buildings were stark, almost institutional in their appearance. There were no signs of life, no welcoming air to the place, just cold, hard reality. Clyde pulled the truck into a small parking area hidden behind some scrub brush, and the two men got out, moving quietly toward the compound. They stayed low out of sight, watching the buildings for any signs of movement. Tommy's heart raced in his chest. Every step closer to the compound felt like a step closer to the truth, no matter how dark or terrible that truth might be. "This is it," Tommy whispered, his voice low and tense. "This is where they've been all these years, isn't it?" Clyde nodded, his eyes scanning the perimeter. "I think so, Tommy. This place, it doesn't sit right with me. But we need to be careful. We don't know what's going on inside." Tommy's gaze stayed fixed on the building ahead. There was something unsettling about the place, but it was also strangely familiar. He had spent so much of his life searching for his sisters that he had built up a mental image of what he thought their life might have been like. The monotony of captivity, the quiet of silence, the fear that must have haunted them. And yet the place before him didn't seem like a prison at all. It felt more like a trap, a carefully constructed illusion designed to make everything seem peaceful, even when it was anything but. They moved closer to the gates, keeping low, and then, without warning, the door to one of the buildings opened. A figure in a black habit appeared, followed by two others. They moved with a purpose, not acknowledging the presence of the men watching from the shadows. Tommy's heart skipped a beat as he recognized one of the figures, the nun he had seen in church, the one with the limp and the scar. There was no mistaking it now. This was one of them. This was the woman who had been with his sisters. He stepped forward, but Clyde caught his arm, pulling him back. "Hold on, Tommy," he said in a harsh whisper. "We don't know what we're dealing with here. We need to wait for the right moment." Tommy hesitated, his mind racing. Every instinct in him screamed to run forward to confront the nun to demand answers, but something held him back, the overwhelming sense that if he acted too soon, he might lose his sisters forever. He looked back toward the building, the shadows growing longer, the silence stretching out like a blackened cloak around them. Somewhere in that compound were the answers, and he was going to find them. He would not stop until he did. Tommy's heart hammered in his chest as he crouched behind a pile of rocks, the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. The figure in the black habit had disappeared inside the building, but the sight of her, the way she moved the limp, there was no denying it now. The moment Tommy had feared for so long had arrived. His sisters, or at least one of them, had been here all this time. But what kind of life had they led? He had thought of them every day, but he had never imagined anything like this dark, hidden place where they had been silenced and forced to endure whatever horrors had occurred behind those walls. Clyde stood a few paces behind Tommy, watching the compound with the same intensity. They both knew they were walking a fine line. Every step closer to the truth felt like it could be their last. It was a dangerous game, and Tommy was tired of playing. "Tommy, we have to be careful," Clyde whispered. His voice was low but firm. "We can't just rush in. This place is more than just a monastery. We don't know what they're hiding in there, but it's clear that it's not what it seems." Tommy nodded, though he didn't feel reassured. He had spent too many years chasing ghosts, and now, with a real lead in front of him, he wasn't about to turn back. "You're right," Tommy said, his voice hoarse. "But I have to know. I have to know if my sisters are in there." Clyde didn't argue. Instead, he motioned for Tommy to follow him. They carefully circled the compound, staying low, moving quietly between the shadows cast by the tall walls. They approached a side gate, which appeared to be less guarded. It was a risk, but at this point they had little choice. Tommy's mind raced with questions. How had his sisters been forced into this life? Had they been told they were there to serve God, to make amends for the sins of their people? Or had they been kept captive, punished for refusing to comply? The questions burned at him, and yet he feared the answers. The gate creaked as Clyde gently pushed it open, the sound so faint it could have been lost in the wind. Tommy held his breath, but no one came running. They slipped through, entering a small courtyard surrounded by stone buildings. The air here felt heavier, thick with the silence of isolation. They walked through the courtyard, eyes scanning the area for any sign of movement. It felt like the world had disappeared, leaving only the two of them in this desolate, forgotten place. Everything here seemed designed to keep secrets hidden. High fences, locked doors, and the eerie stillness that hung over everything. The only sound was the soft rustling of the wind through the desert brush. Tommy's gaze shifted to the building in front of them. It was one of the larger structures, its windows small and shuttered. He felt the same sense of dread he had felt when he first set eyes on the compound. It was a place designed to keep people and not let them out. "Let's check inside," Tommy whispered. Clyde gave him a reluctant nod, and they moved toward the building. They crept up the stone steps, making their way to a side entrance. Tommy's heart raced in his chest, each footfall heavy with anticipation. This was it, the moment of truth. As they reached the door, Clyde put a hand on Tommy's arm, halting him. "Wait," Clyde murmured. "There's someone inside." Tommy didn't need to be told twice. He pressed his ear to the door, trying to listen for any sounds. At first there was nothing, just the faint hum of the wind and the distant cry of a bird in the desert. But then he heard its soft murmurs, the distinct sound of a voice speaking low and urgent. He held his breath, straining to hear. Was it one of the nuns? Was it his sisters? He couldn't tell. Clyde motioned for him to follow as he slowly pushed the door open, just wide enough for them to slip inside. They entered a small, dimly lit hallway. The air was stale, musty, with the scent of old wood and stone. It was a far cry from the church they had visited earlier, and it felt colder here, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. They moved down the hall cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the thick stone floors. The murmur of voices grew louder as they approached the first room. Tommy's pulse quickened, his chest tight with anxiety. He needed to see for himself. He needed to know if his sisters were inside. Clyde paused, holding up a hand to signal that they should stop. He peered around the corner, his eyes scanning the room. "There's a woman in there," he whispered, "and a man." Tommy's breath caught in his throat. The man had to be Father Milford II, the priest who had been the face of the boarding school, the one who had taken his sisters away all those years ago. Tommy's hands clenched into fists at his sides, the anger threatening to consume him. He had seen that face before, the same man who had stood behind his sisters in that photograph, smiling for the cameras like everything was fine. But Tommy knew better. "Let's get a closer look," Tommy said, his voice thick with determination. They crept forward, moving silently through the darkened hallway. The door was ajar, and Tommy could just make out the figures inside. Father Milford stood with his back to them, speaking to one of the nuns. His words were too soft to hear clearly, but Tommy could see the woman's posture. Her head bowed in a way that seemed wrong. His heart skipped a beat as his gaze fell on the woman's face. She wasn't just any nun. It was Naomi, his sister. Tommy froze, his body tensing. This was it. This was the moment he had waited for, the moment he had feared for so long. Naomi stood before him, her face gaunt, her eyes empty, as though the life had been drained from her. She looked so different, so changed. But the scar on her temple, the one he had seen years ago, was still there, marking her as the same person. His sister had been right there, within his reach all these years, and he had never known. Father Milford's voice broke through Tommy's reverie, snapping him back to reality. "We are close to the final stage," Father Milford said. "The spirits are testing us. We must remain patient. They are coming." Tommy didn't know what the priest was talking about, but it didn't matter. He had to act now, before it was too late. With a nod from Clyde, they quickly retreated, stepping back into the shadows. Tommy's heart was pounding in his ears, but he didn't stop. His sister was so close, but she was still trapped in this place under the priest's control, just like she had been all those years ago. He turned to Clyde, his eyes burning with determination. "We're getting her out," Tommy said. "Tonight." Clyde didn't hesitate. "We'll get them all out." And with that they moved back toward the compound's edge, ready to make their move. The truth had been revealed, but the fight was far from over. Tommy wasn't going to stop until every last secret was uncovered, and his sisters were free. Tommy's heart thudded in his chest as he and Clyde crouched behind the low stone wall, watching the darkening compound. The world around them seemed to hold its breath, the shadows growing longer, the night stretching its fingers across the desert. Tonight, Tommy murmured, his voice tight with anticipation, "We get them out." Clyde, who had been Tommy's anchor through all this madness, nodded. His hand rested on the small revolver tucked into the waistband of his jeans, an unspoken agreement that tonight they wouldn't rely on words. They needed action. The compound loomed in front of them, the low hum of activity faint in the background. 2 guards stood at the entrance eyes, scanning the road, their postures casual but alert. The large steel gate stood like a barricade, keeping the secrets within secrets that Tommy had waited 40 years to unearth. "There's no way we can just walk in," Clyde said, his eyes narrowing. "We'll have to get their attention, draw them away." Tommy glanced at the compound's edge, where the shadows of the old adobe walls appeared like giant silhouettes against the desert's horizon. Every detail of this place was familiar to him in some unsettling way. He could almost feel the weight of the past pressing down on him, like the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. "I have an idea," Tommy replied, his mind already racing ahead. Clyde didn't question him. They had learned over the years of searching for his sisters that sometimes you had to make your own way. Tommy had never expected that his search would lead him to the very edge of something sinister, a place where hope mixed with horror. "All right," Tommy said, moving forward. "We'll create a distraction." As they approached the back corner of the compound, Tommy spotted an old service shed. It looked abandoned, but its door was slightly ajar, just enough for them to slip inside. Inside, Tommy found what he was looking for, an old canister of gasoline. His plan was simple: draw the guards' attention with a controlled fire, create enough noise and chaos to distract them, and use the cover to slip inside undetected. Clyde, always steady under pressure, was already preparing the gasoline, pouring it in a wide arc near the corner of the building. "This'll work," he muttered, striking a match and tossing it onto the trail of gas. The flames flared up immediately, the fire crackling and rising into the air. The guards at the entrance looked up, startled by the sudden eruption of light and smoke. "Perfect," Tommy whispered, feeling a surge of adrenaline. "Let's move." They darted through the shadows, their footsteps soft on the dusty ground, as the fire drew the attention of the guards. Tommy's mind raced, remembering the time when his sisters had been taken, the cold indifference with which the authorities had swept them away. But tonight Tommy wasn't going to let anyone sweep anything under the rug. This wasn't just about his sisters anymore. It was about justice, about making sure this dark place could never hide the truth again. They reached the side door of the main building, a small wooden entrance, weathered by time and the desert's harsh winds. Tommy tried the handle, it turned, and the door creaked open quietly. Inside, the air was cool, smelling of old wood and incense. It felt eerily familiar, like stepping into a forgotten memory. The hallway stretched out before them, narrow and dim, with flickering candlelight casting long shadows. Tommy felt his heart skip a beat as he imagined his sisters walking through these very halls all those years ago, perhaps with the same confused and frightened expressions they'd worn as children. They moved quickly, Clyde leading the way, his eyes scanning every corner. Tommy followed, his breath shallow each step, bringing them closer to the truth and to Naomi, Sarah, and Eva. As they neared the stairs that led down to the underground chamber, they heard voices, low, whispering voices, and the sound of something metallic clinking as if being dragged across stone. Tommy's stomach churned. It was clear the nuns weren't alone. They crouched down, trying to stay hidden behind a nearby pillar. From their vantage point, Tommy could just make out 2 figures at the bottom of the stairs. Father Milford II and one of the older nuns. They were speaking in hushed tones, but their words were too low for Tommy to hear clearly. A faint flicker of movement in the shadows caught Tommy's eye. Naomi. His heart lurched in his chest as he saw her, a figure draped in the familiar black habit, her head down, her posture rigid, as if she was being led somewhere. The sight of her was like a punch to the gut. She had changed so much, her eyes were hollow, her face thinner than he remembered. But there was no mistaking it. That was his sister. "We need to get down there," Tommy whispered urgently to Clyde. Clyde nodded, already moving toward the stairs. He glanced back at Tommy, his eyes full of resolve. They had come this far. They weren't turning back now. The stairs creaked beneath their feet as they descended, the sounds of the voices growing louder. As they reached the bottom, they saw a row of heavy wooden doors, each locked tightly, each hiding its own secret. Tommy's fingers trembled as he reached for the nearest door, pulling it open as quietly as possible. Inside, the scene before him was nothing like what he had imagined. There were no holy prayers, no peace. Instead, there were tools, ropes, chains, and scattered religious symbols. The dim light from the candles only added to the surreal, disturbing atmosphere of the room. Naomi stood by the altar, her back turned to them, but her head shot up when she heard the door creak. Her eyes locked onto Tommy's, and for the first time in years, a flicker of recognition flashed across her face. It was Naomi, his little sister, standing right there before him. "Tommy," she whispered, her voice hoarse. It was her. Tommy stepped forward, his hands reaching for her, his heart swelling with both relief and overwhelming emotion. "Naomi," he breathed, "you're safe. You're here." But Naomi's face fell, the fear in her eyes, making Tommy freeze in place. "You shouldn't be here," she said in a voice so quiet it barely reached his ears. "You have to leave. It's not safe." Tommy's breath caught in his throat. "I'm not leaving without you, Naomi. We're getting out of here. All of us." Naomi shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "You don't understand. It's too late. They won't let us go. They'll hurt you. They'll hurt all of us." Father Milford appeared from the shadows, his face twisted with malice, and Tommy felt the weight of years of injustice and pain come crashing down on him. "You should have stayed away, Tommy," he said, his voice cold, calculating. "Your little sisters have learned their place. You should have stayed in your lane." But Tommy wasn't listening anymore. His heart was full of something else, rage, fury, and the need to make things right. "You're not getting away with this," Tommy said, stepping forward. As Tommy stood in the cold, dim room, he knew this moment would define the rest of his life. The fight for his sisters had begun, and there was no turning back.